Welcome back to Tiny Blue Games. My name's of course Seesaw or Chris, and today we're talking about Guild Wars 2 in 2020. Today's video is going to be a very quick video that focuses on my top 3 favorite things about Guild Wars 2 and least favorite things about Guild Wars 2 in its current state. Now, if you've been to my channel before, you'll know I've made a lot of videos about this game, and they're typically longer format reviews or comparison videos to other MMOs. I wanted this to be a bit more concise and really benefit players that might be coming to the game for the first time, or veteran players that are returning to the game and want to know what to expect when entering the game. Alright, so we're going to progress through the video by alternating between good points and bad points. That way we give a good mix of pros and cons instead of just sort of heavily leaning on one side and then heavily leaning on the other side. I think it's a good balanced approach. But with that, let's dive into our first good point, pro, love, whatever you want to call it, of the video. So one of my absolute favorite systems in Guild Wars 2 is the mount system, and it's very interesting because a lot of people, kind of myself included, didn't necessarily want mounts added to the game when we first heard about it. We thought that it would take away from some of the exploration and the ways you travel across the map and just typically make things a lot easier to do. I mean, the game is very much focused on map exploration. There's jumping puzzles, there's viewpoints you have to get to, skill points you have to get to. There's a lot of things that are very determined by your ability to jump around and navigate the map. And it felt like mounts would kind of take away from this. Well, they actually make a lot of these systems way more interesting. And as times progress, we've seen that the game has added more and more unique ways to actually use the different mounts that are in the game to make more interesting puzzles and ways to get to different areas. So it's not only improved things, it's actually given more ways to enjoy the exploration of the game. To add to this, as Guild Wars 2 doesn't have traditional vertical progression, the mount system adds a really nice way to progress your character, to progress your account, while maintaining the horizontal progression system. As the game has continued to add new mounts to the game, new collections for these mounts, there's new ways to expand your character and make yourself feel A, different than other players, and B, more powerful as you continue collecting things in-game. The first negative I want to talk about is probably one of the more widely discussed negatives about the game, and it's also kind of a two-part point, where there's one that a lot of people will maybe agree with, and one that's maybe more of my preference kind of thing, but it's optimization and third-party add-ons. Now, the optimization of Guild Wars 2 is kind of good and kind of bad. The way I see it is it's designed to run really well on both medium and low spec computers. The difficulty is that the performance does not increase very well when you have higher spec computers. So you can have someone who does really well in other games and then comes to Guild Wars 2 and the performance is going to be quite lackluster, and that can really hurt people's first impressions of the game. Now, this is a big issue for a lot of people because you know the game's built to be beautiful, and if you can't experience that beauty without realizing some of the stuttering that happens, some of the frame drops that happens, and hell, there's even a couple bugs here and there, it's really gonna cause you to enjoy your journey less than you would if the game had better optimization. The second little part to this point is add-ons and third-party programs. Now, the tie-in is that there are certain add-ons or programs that can improve the performance and look of your game. The issue with this is that they are created by players, which isn't necessarily an issue, but they're not supported in the same way you might see add-ons in World of Warcraft or the Elder Scrolls Online, where there are websites that have libraries of add-ons that are well known by the developers. Yes, these add-ons are technically well known by developers, and yes, people haven't been banned for using them, but they still kind of occupy a gray area where if you're a completely new player, you're definitely not going to have them when you get your first experience with the game. So that first experience could still be ruined, and B, even if you are playing the game for a little while, you might not be comfortable going out of your way, finding these programs, adding them in the way they need to be added, updating them in the way they need to be updated, and it overall might decrease your enjoyment of the game. So I think it's a bit of an issue, and I'm not entirely sure what the proper decision is. I feel like ultimately we're just going to be stuck in the current situation. Ideally, though, I'd love to see them open it up like World of Warcraft or The Elder Scrolls Online and having multiple new add-ons and sites that you can go get them. Or B, if there's specific add-ons that a lot of people use, having ArenaNet absorb these add-ons and actually do them in a professional, non-third-party manner. But this is kind of wishful thinking, and we'll just move on to the next point. Alright, so the next good thing about Guild Wars 2 is the exploration and sheer amount of maps for you to discover. Now this ties in really well to the first point of mounts, because if you're looking for just places to go and ride your mount and enjoy the beauty of the world, Guild Wars 2 has a ton of options for you. There's a ton of different biomes and different worlds for you to experience. Added to that, you have different achievements and specific objectives in maps, such as jumping puzzles, viewpoints, skill points. There's just a ton of things to collect, and it feels very, very rewarding. On top of all of this, there are proper systems in place to reward characters for doing this discovery. For instance, each map will have a map completion where you need to fulfill all of the objectives, and then on top of that, the whole world will have a map completion objective that is required to build those flashy legendaries, or certain flashy legendaries, which is really, really cool. And mixed with all of this, you have underwater exploration. The underwater combat in Guild Wars 2 might not have been touched in a long while, but if you come from a different MMO and you dive into the water of Guild Wars 2, you are instantly going to know you're playing a complete different level of underwater combat, which in itself is just so magical to explore. You see so many different visuals that you just don't get in other games, and then when you get out of the water, you get these pretty droplets. I remember seeing these when the first videos of Guild Wars 2 came out, and I was like, wow, that is super cool. Well, it's been many years later, and when I come out of water and I see these droplets on my screen, I'm still in awe. And we are flipping back to the negative side of things, and I wanted to talk about suffering or discarded content. And this really has to do with types of content that aren't being worked on regularly or might have been abandoned altogether. And there's quite a few things in Guild Wars 2 that fit this definition, and it's kind of unfortunate, but I get why they do it. It's hard if it's a piece of content that you really enjoy in the game. Now, the very first example of this is dungeons. A lot of people really enjoy them, a lot of people didn't enjoy them, and ultimately they made new content types such as Fractals of the Mist to replace them. And because of that, they have just kind of been left there in the game. Now, there have been updates that have increased their usability. For instance, we have certain daily achievements and ways to make gold from them, but for the bigger point of the game, they haven't been integrated into the newer systems, and they kind of are a question mark for new players when they come in. It's kind of hard for players to be like, okay, so this is the dungeon system, but then there's also the fractal system, which are kind of dungeons, but kind of different, and have this thing called agony, and where do I start? So it gets a little bit jarring for new players. Now, there's other more modern types of content that have also suffered from this. You could look both at Fractals of the Mist and raids for this. Both of these have had, periodically new pieces of content added to them, but the waiting period between the next piece of content can vary, and more than that, it's uncertain as to when there will be a new piece added. And that gets really hard for players to keep going at it, keep enjoying the current stuff when they don't know if, hey, this might be the last new raid that comes to the game. I don't know if I'm going to keep playing. So it gets a little bit complicated that way, and I think a lot of this will have to come to kind of the final point I'm going to make, which has to do with lack of vision and lack of proper planning. But we'll discuss more about that in the final point. The final good point on my list is probably one of the most important aspects of any MMO, and that is the combat. Now, the combat in Guild Wars 2 is very interesting because when I first played the game, I was like, this is pretty cool. This is a good step towards action combat. And as time progressed, I kind of assumed, and I feel like a lot of people were in this situation, that we'd see combat and action combat in MMOs improve drastically over the years. But as time's gone on, and more games have introduced different ways of doing action combat, I keep looking back at Guild Wars 2 and I'm like, they kind of did it perfectly because it keeps a lot of the best parts of tab targeting and then mixes in action combat elements. For instance, as a ranger, you have the ability to focus your target and make sure your shots are going to hit that target and you're not missing and you're not confused about what's happening. But at the same time, you're dodge rolling and avoiding specific targeted attacks on the ground. I think the best benefit of this game and this way of doing combat is that as a player, it's pretty easy to understand what's happening. Specifically in lower amounts of players, you can see where attacks are going. You're not confused necessarily. It does get more confusing when you add more people, that's for sure, but it's a really interesting way of doing things. The other side of this is that we have skill interaction with other characters. Yes, we have buffs, which happen in a lot of MMOs, but we also have a lot of ways to interact with other people's attacks, be it using certain explosions in different fire fields or blinding fields. It feels very unique when you play with different classes, and I think that's a really important way of making the classes in Guild Wars 2 feel impactful, which a lot of games kind of struggle with. Alright, so I kind of alluded to this last negative point in the previous negative point, but it has to do with planning, the vision of the game, and system overhauls. Now, one of the biggest struggles I think with Guild Wars 2 is they kind of keep reinventing how they're going to do things. And don't get me wrong, this is a good thing. A lot of games actually suffer from the complete opposite of not being willing to change it up. But I think Guild Wars 2 has done it maybe too many times, and certainly without communicating it properly to their player base. Now, one of the biggest examples I want to give is a brief comparison to the other big MMOs that I usually compare to. We have games such as World of Warcraft, Final Fantasy XIV, and The Elder Scrolls Online. And in each of these games, you could ask me, how does content get released? Well, in World of Warcraft, I could tell you every 2 years there's an expansion, and then every quarter there's usually a big content patch with a few raids within a year. It's pretty predictable how things are going to go. Final Fantasy, kind of the same situation. Elder Scrolls Online, hey, there's a new chapter every year, there's a DLC every quarter, and you can kind of expect that. Guild Wars 2, question mark, question mark, question mark. Sometimes there's going to be expansions, sometimes it seems like they're going to not do expansions, and then they secretly announce that they will do an expansion in a blog post. There's a lot of confusion as to what's going to happen and whether it's going to change. Now, I think it's good that they try new things. For instance, they were the first to try this living world style of content. They saw that it had its good parts and its bad parts, and they shifted into a expansion and living world situation that I think is really good. And it was working really well for a while as we went through Hot, and then moved into Path of Fire, but then we got to a point where we weren't sure if there was another expansion coming, and we kind of fell off the train again. So I think it's all about keeping the communication going and keeping with what's working. If something is doing well, keep doing it, and that's one of the hardest things to do. Now, this is also applicable to some of the systems. As I've mentioned, we moved from dungeons to fractals to raids to strike missions, and yes, each iteration brings some benefits to the game, but at a certain point, as a player, you kind of want to know if a type of content that you love is going to just be part of the game forever, or if it's going to be just a step on their way to something new. Now, we're at a point where fractals feel like they are a core part of Guild Wars 2. They've been here for so long, and we've periodically, yes, but consistently seen new fractals added over the entire lifespan almost of Guild Wars 2. So yeah, that feels solidified. But now we're in a point where we see raids kind of, stepping into the background and strike missions kind of being the new stepping stone. And as a player who really loves raids, it makes you wonder, will we ever see a new raid, or is it strike missions for the future? And just having more communication on that, I think really would help. Obviously, as a developer, you don't want to overpromise, you don't want to lock yourself into anything, but the more you can share, the better. And there you have it. Those are my top 3 things I love and top 3 things I hate about Guild Wars 2 in 2020. If you enjoyed this video, please drop a like, comment, subscribe. I love all that stuff, and it does really help out the channel. More than that, I am an ArenaNet partner, and you will find some sponsored links in the description below. If you use those to either try the free version of Guild Wars 2, which is awesome by the way, it's the entire free base game, or if you decide to buy any of the expansions through those links, it does help me out a lot. But if you don't feel like doing that and you just want to subscribe, learn about Guild Wars 2, learn about some other MMOs, I'd be more than happy to have you along for the journey. Thanks for watching everyone, hopefully you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one.